Buildings remember things people forget. Parking garages remember in the plainest language of all: concrete, wiring, and light. Desmond Ruel has spent 25 years learning to read that language inside the Corvale Municipal Parking Garage, a 7-level concrete structure built in 1976 to serve the county courthouse and nearby government offices. He was 60 now, facilities supervisor for a building most people never thought about twice. The kind of structure built purely to be functional, rarely admired. He had learned to pay attention to the garage from a man named Otto Crenshaw, who had held Desmond's job for 22 years before him, and who approached even the smallest maintenance issue with what he called professional stubbornness, a refusal to log a repair without first understanding why it failed in the first place. Desmond started at the garage at 35, hired as Crenshaw's assistant during a period when the county was expanding weekend courthouse hours and needed someone who could handle overnight facility checks. Crenshaw was 62 then, a heavy-set man with slow, deliberate movements and a habit of standing beneath a flickering fixture for several minutes before ever touching it, as though giving the problem a chance to explain itself. Anybody can replace a bulb, Crenshaw told him, during Desmond's first week, the two of them standing on level 4 beneath a fixture that had been cycling on and off erratically all winter. That's not the job. The job is figuring out why the bulb needed replacing in the first place. If you skip that part, you're not fixing anything. You're just delaying the next conversation. Crenshaw kept a shoebox of index cards, one per recurring issue, each one filled with observational notes rather than simple repair logs. Not bulb replaced. Instead, what the bulb was doing before it failed, what the wiring looked like, what the weather had been, what else was happening nearby, whether the concrete around the fixture felt cold to the touch or ordinary. Desmond had thought in his first months that this was excessive for a job that mostly involved sweeping stairwells and checking fire extinguisher tags. He remembered asking Crenshaw once, half joking, whether the county was paying him to fix lights or write a novel about them. Crenshaw hadn't laughed. He'd said, "Depends which one solved the problem," and gone back to writing. Desmond understood, years later, that it had never been excessive at all. It was the only reason anyone would ever be able to look back decades later and see a pattern rather than a string of disconnected repairs. Crenshaw retired when Desmond was 40. He left behind a shoebox, a handshake, and a single piece of advice that Desmond had carried with him for 2 decades afterward. This building doesn't lie to you. It just doesn't always explain itself the first time you ask. Desmond had read every card in that shoebox during his first year alone with it. Most of them were unremarkable. A drainage issue on level 2 that resolved itself after a gutter repair, a keypad malfunction at the pedestrian entrance that turned out to be a simple wiring fault. But one card, for a fixture above parking space 412 on level 4, near the garage's northeast support column, had entry stretching back further than any other card in the box. The earliest entry, dated 1983, read, "Fixture 412 flickering again. Worse this winter than last. Wiring tested sound. Ballast replaced twice. Pattern returns every year. Always worse in January. Always better by June. Something in that column is moving with the cold." Desmond had read that entry a dozen times before he understood what Crenshaw meant by moving with the cold. He wasn't describing a mechanical fault. He was describing a pattern. The same fixture, the same section of the garage, behaving differently depending on the season, year after year, in a way that outlasted every repair anyone attempted. The Corvale garage had been built quickly on a tight municipal budget during a stretch of unusually cold weather in the winter of 1976. Desmond knew this the way he knew most things about the building, not from a formal historical record, since the garage had never seemed important enough to warrant one, but from the accumulated knowledge Crenshaw had passed down and Desmond had continued gathering on his own, one small observation at a time, across 2.5 decades of walking the same 7 levels of poured concrete. He knew which stairwells held heat oddly in summer, long after sundown, as though the concrete had absorbed more than its share of the day's warmth. He knew the freight elevator on the south end ran, with a faint hesitation that had nothing to do with its motor and everything to do with a slightly warped guide rail nobody had ever bothered replacing, because it never actually caused a failure. Only a half-second pause riders rarely noticed. He knew the pedestrian stairwell on level 6 echoed differently in humid weather, footsteps arriving a fraction louder than they should. He knew the building's habits the way you know a person you've worked alongside for decades. Not through documentation, but through presence, through thousands of ordinary mornings spent simply walking through and paying attention. Fixture 412 was different from all of that. It wasn't a habit. It was a message, repeated every winter, that nobody before Crenshaw had thought to write down, and that nobody after Crenshaw, until Desmond himself started paying real attention, had thought to track with any precision. He began his own observations in his third year with the shoebox, initially just confirming what Crenshaw's card already described. Each October, he made a note of the fixture's baseline behavior. Each January, he checked it again, standing beneath it on cold mornings with his breath visible in the concrete stairwell, watching the light stutter in a rhythm that felt, if he let himself think about it too long, almost deliberate. He replaced the ballast a third time, then a fourth, following Crenshaw's earlier repair pattern almost exactly, half expecting a different result, simply because more time had passed and technology had presumably improved. The pattern held. Nothing changed. The fixture kept its own private calendar, indifferent to whichever ballast happened to be installed inside it that year. In his 9th year with the shoebox, Desmond started keeping something Crenshaw's simpler notes had never included: a precise flicker frequency count, measured with a small handheld tool he'd read about in a trade publication, designed to quantify exactly how erratic a fixture's cycling had become rather than simply noting that it flickered. He took a baseline reading in June, when the fixture behaved closest to normal. He took another in January, when it was at its worst. He repeated this every year for nearly a decade before he had enough data to notice something Crenshaw's qualitative notes alone could never have shown clearly. The January readings were getting worse. Not dramatically. Not enough that any single year would have alarmed him on its own. But laid out across 9 years of measurements, the trend was unmistakable. The winter flicker was intensifying, decade over decade, exactly the way a slow illness worsens before anyone notices the earlier symptoms were connected. He sat with that thought for a long time one January evening, alone in the small facility's office off level 1. The shoebox open on the desk in front of him, a space heater humming against the cold that always seeped up to the concrete this time of year. Crenshaw had noticed the pattern first. Crenshaw had never known what caused it, and now Desmond had confirmed something Crenshaw's notes only suspected, that whatever was happening near that column wasn't stable. It was getting slowly worse. The way a hairline crack in a sidewalk widens by degrees, so small no single winter ever seems responsible, until one day the whole slab has shifted and nobody can say exactly when. He wrote the finding into his own notebook that night, beneath Crenshaw's original card. In the same understated hand Crenshaw had taught him without meaning to, 9 years of January readings confirmed gradual worsening. Not dramatic. Consistent, 'cause still unknown. Continuing to watch. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest word he had. He had a theory, in his 14th year, that the issue might simply be a legacy wiring incompatibility, an older gauge of wire, installed during the original 1976 construction, that behaved differently under seasonal voltage fluctuation than the modern wiring used everywhere else in later repairs. He spent the better part of summer tracing the fixture's electrical circuit back to its original panel, cross-referencing wire gauges and insulation types against the garage's remaining construction documentation, convinced he had finally isolated something concrete enough to fix permanently. The wiring checked out. It matched the gauge and insulation used throughout the rest of Level 4, installed during the same original construction phase, showing no unusual degradation or incompatibility that would explain a seasonal pattern unique to just that one fixture. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the shoebox, in the same understated style Crenshaw had modeled for him without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Wiring gauge theory. Ruled out. Circuit matches surrounding fixtures exactly. No incompatibility found. Cause is not electrical. Back to unexplained. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the wiring to be the answer. It was clean, replaceable, the kind of explanation that let a person close a question instead of continuing to carry it forward year after year without resolution. Being wrong meant the cause lived somewhere Desmond's usual tools couldn't easily reach. Not in the wiring, not in the fixture itself, but somewhere in the structure surrounding it. The modernization announcement arrived in his 23rd year. The county had approved a full lighting upgrade for the garage. LED fixtures replacing the aging fluorescent system throughout all 7 levels, along with a new sealed conduit system designed to modernize the electrical infrastructure and reduce long-term maintenance costs. The project brief specified that new wiring would run directly through the existing structural columns wherever the original construction allowed, including the northeast column above space 412. Desmond read the brief and felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the lighting upgrade itself. The new conduit system was described as sealed and rigid, a permanent installation designed to eliminate the kind of maintenance access that had allowed him and Crenshaw to keep replacing ballast and testing wiring at that fixture for over 40 years. Once installed, that column would be closed off in a way it had never been before. And the new LED drivers he knew from the manufacturer specifications included in the brief were considerably more sensitive to physical stress than the old fluorescent ballasts had ever been, designed for stable, unmoving installation conditions, not for whatever had been causing fixture 412 to behave differently from every other light in the building for 4 decades. He brought Crenshaw's original shoebox, along with his own decade of precise flicker measurements, to the modernization project's electrical contractor. The contractor was a careful, experienced man named Foster Adair, who reviewed Desmond's records with genuine attention rather than dismissing them outright. The wiring diagrams showed nothing unusual at that column, Adair said, after examining the plan spread across a folding table in the site office. Whatever's been causing the flicker, it's almost certainly a legacy ballast compatibility issue. Old fluorescent ballasts are sensitive to voltage fluctuation in ways modern LED drivers simply aren't. Once we install the new system, that kind of flicker should disappear entirely, regardless of what's been causing it all these years. The pattern isn't random, Desmond said. It's seasonal. It's been getting worse for over 40 years. I don't think a different kind of fixture fixes a cause we've never actually identified. I understand the concern, Adair said, and he seemed to mean it. But I don't have engineering justification to delay a countywide lighting modernization based on a flicker pattern that's never once caused an electrical fault or safety violation in 4 decades of service. The new system is rated well beyond what that fixture's ever needed to handle. It was a reasonable position, and Desmond didn't have a competing electrical credential to argue against it directly. What he had was a shoebox of cards spanning 2 careers, and a growing, unshakable sense that something about that specific column had never behaved like the rest of the building. Desmond didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept returning to an uncomfortable question he couldn't fully answer. What if Adair was simply right, and 40 years of flicker was nothing more than an old fixture struggling against old technology, a problem that would vanish the moment modern equipment replaced it? He had wanted for years for the seasonal pattern to mean something structural, something significant enough to justify the care he and Crenshaw together had poured into tracking across 4 combined decades. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually matching. He pulled Crenshaw's oldest card out of the shoebox one more evening, sitting alone in the small facility's office with the overhead light humming quietly above him, and reread the 1983 entry slowly. Something in that column is moving with the cold. Crenshaw had never known what that meant either. He had simply written it down, trusting that the observation itself was worth preserving even without an explanation attached. Desmond had inherited that same trust without ever fully testing whether it held up against a modern electrical engineer's confident assessment. He didn't have the cause confirmed yet, but not having it hadn't stopped Crenshaw from writing the first card in 1983, and it wasn't a reason for Desmond to stop pushing now, with the column about to be sealed behind rigid new conduit for the foreseeable future. He requested, at his own initiative, a single afternoon with a structural engineer before the new conduit installation began. Not to delay the modernization project, he made clear I want to understand what was happening inside that specific column before it became permanently inaccessible. The engineer was a woman named Priya Anand, who specialized in older concrete structures and their long-term behavior under seasonal stress. She reviewed the garage's original 1976 construction records alongside Desmond's decades of flicker data, and she brought precision monitoring equipment to track the column's actual physical movement over several days spanning a cold snap that winter. What she found confirmed with follow-up measurements 2 weeks later during a milder stretch of weather, explained 40 years of a pattern nobody had ever been able to name. The northeast support column above space 412 had been poured during an unusually cold December in 1976. Using a rush curing process the original construction crew adopted to stay on schedule despite the weather. Standard practice called for extended curing time and specific temperature controls during cold weather concrete work, but the original record showed a change order authorizing an accelerated curing additive instead, a common shortcut when a project was falling behind and needed to close out before a hard freeze made further pouring impossible. That rushed curing process had left a subtle, undocumented weakness in the column's expansion joint. Nothing severe enough to threaten the structure's overall integrity, but enough to make that specific column contract and expand more dramatically with seasonal temperature swings than any other column in the building. This column has more seasonal movement than it should, Priya explained to Desmond, reviewing her measurements afterward. Not dangerous movement, not structural failure, but real, measurable flexing that happens every winter as the joint contracts in the cold, and every summer as it relaxes again. That movement's been transmitted up to the conduit and fixture housing above it for over 40 years. Worse each winter as the joint's degradation slowly compounds. And the new sealed system? Desmond asked. The old fixture housing had some give in it, Priya said. Enough flexibility to absorb that movement without transmitting it directly into the ballast. A rigid sealed conduit won't have that same give. It'll transfer the column's seasonal flexing straight into components that were never designed to move at all. Priya's findings went to the Modernization Committee within the week. Foster Adair reviewed her full report personally and called Desmond afterward. You were right to push for this, Adair said. If we had installed the sealed system as planned, we had been building electrical failures into that column from day one. Probably wouldn't have shown up until the first hard winter after installation, and by then it would have looked like a completely unrelated problem. The installation plan was revised. The northeast column's conduit run was redesigned with flexible connections specifically engineered to absorb the column's seasonal movement, rather than fighting against it. The rest of the garage's lighting modernization proceeded on schedule, but that one column received an approach built around what the building had actually been doing for over 40 years, rather than what the original drawings assumed it would do. The county facilities office filed a formal note in its permanent records, crediting both Otto Crenshaw's original 1983 observation and Desmond's 23 years of continued measurement as the reason the structural condition had been identified and properly addressed before the modernization project sealed it away for good. Desmond kept the shoebox. He added a final card before finally moving the whole collection from his own desk drawer into the county facilities archive. Northeast column, level 4, flexible conduit connection, installed this year. Original condition traced to 1976 cold weather curing shortcut, documented in formally 1983 to 2024. Fixture 412 stable through its first full winter under the new system. Otto, you were right that something was moving. Neither of us knew what for a very long time. He stood beneath the new fixture on a cold evening in January, the first winter after repair, watching it hold steady without a single flicker. The light stayed even and calm, the same pale white it held all summer, indifferent now to the temperature dropping outside. He stood there longer than the moment required. The way Crenshaw used to stand in front of a problem before touching it, giving it a chance to say something else if it wanted to. It didn't. It simply held its light, steady and unremarkable, the way every other fixture in the garage did. He thought about Crenshaw, standing in the same spot decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire that the building didn't lie. It just didn't always explain itself the first time you asked. Desmond had carried that sentence through 25 years, through a ruled-out wiring theory, through a season of genuine doubt about whether careful attention amounted to anything more than stubbornness. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep watching, the way Crenshaw had taught him, until the building finally explained itself to someone patient enough to listen through 40 winters instead of one. Somewhere in the county archive now, a shoebox of index cards sat quietly on a shelf, 2 different handwritings recording the same plain observation across 4 decades. Something isn't right here, and I don't know why yet, but I'm going to keep watching until I do.